Welcome to A Penny for Your Thoughts.
Looking forward to the conversation today.
Andrew, this is one that I asked if I could kind of do the introduction to. So a pretty special day with a great topic talking about nitrogen. And we're here in studio with Dr. Mike Castellano. He's been a guest before. We appreciate you joining us. And we are trying something new today where we have a special guest, not in studio with us, but in studio in spirit and on video, Dr. Andrew Margenot from Illinois. So welcome, guys. Appreciate you joining us.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
And I got to say before we get started that this is the first guest that Sean lined up, and I love when I hear people get excited about science. You know, it's one of those things as I go out and just with my role, just training people and talking about science and agronomy, getting to hear a passion from others, you know, is awesome. And I got a call from Sean one day, and I don't think he could be more excited. He sounded like a 12-year-old schoolgirl, how excited he was. He was like, man, we got to get this guy on the podcast. So I'm looking forward. I mean, we got two leaders in the area of nitrogen research here with us today. So looking forward to the conversation. And I'm curious to see how giddy Sean gets as we continue with this.
I've already put a little bit of pressure on Andrew, Dr. Margenot, as we start, because this is my first guest, and so far they've all been exceptional. So he's got a high bar. But Andrew, I'd like to just tell a little bit of a story for our listeners. We talk a lot about we have to be passionate and curious, otherwise, you know, we don't bring value. And so I got to meet Dr. Margenot at a presentation he gave talking about the research he's doing. And it comes at a time where we've got, especially in the state of Iowa, but I think probably all over the Corn Belt, a lot of people asking questions around trying to understand, how do I manage my nitrogen? How do I make sure it stays, you know, where it belongs, ends up in its intended target? And specifically, a lot of work around just what's really happening in our water, right? And that's super important. As farmers and advisors and scientists, we have a responsibility to steward the technology we have. And to Andrew Penny's point, when Dr. Margenot was presenting, I just found myself going, man, I'm really, really grateful for your passion and your curiosity. The work that you're going to share with us is not easy work by any means. I don't think most people would be eager to jump right in and do some of the hard work that you and your team are doing. And so I really did. I don't think I made it out of the room I was in before I was on the phone with Penny going, we got to get Mike and Andrew together. And so we are going to do the format of our show slightly different. So as our audience knows, traditionally what we do is Andrew and I will interview. What we're going to ask both Dr. Castellano and Dr. Margenot to do is participate in those interviews. Like Andrew said, both experts in the area of nitrogen. So I ask you guys to chime in wherever you see fit. As we start today, though, we always have kind of two questions we ask. And so Dr. Margenot, as our new guest on the show, we're gonna start with you. What has you excited in agriculture today? Actually, I need to flip that around, don't I?
You do.
Before we do that,
I was about to take it over since you're doing the introductions and like
there you go. Flip it around.
Yeah, we'll try something
Get
different.
us all screwed up.
So Andrew, give us your background. Kind of tell us where you're from, where you went to school.
Same state as Mike, Rhode Island. So you've got two people from that same state in the studio here. Background, I grew up in the suburbs of New England. My mother is from Europe, and so I grew up a little bit around wheat farming in the south of Europe, but really, like most folks in that part of the world, in New England, there's not a whole lot of ag as we think of ag in the Midwest. And so I went to college to study chemistry, philosophy, thought medical school was the right route, and read a Michael Pollan book on food. And that was the gateway for thinking about food production. And one thing led to another, and it got me sucked into where I am now in a good way. So that's the honest story. I had no idea what I was getting into. And funny story, I almost went to do grad school with Mike, and I was this close to going to Iowa State. And
Did
so
you guys know each other ahead of grad school?
No, and I think 2010, I had applied to Iowa State for grad school, and Mike saw the application and flew me out. That was my first time setting foot in the Corn Belt, was talking to Mike in 2010. Yeah.
That's kind of cool.
Yep.
That is crazy. It is a very small world. And I'm always reminded of that in agriculture, right? Like there's small groups of people doing a lot of this work. It's crazy that that connection existed. So
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. It's pretty funny how things worked out. So now here I am in the Corn Belt, and Mike's work has inspired me. I have to say here, I'm not an N expert like Mike is. I'm a phosphorus guy making a foray into nitrogen because it's inescapable for good reason. So I just want to make that very clear.
it sounds like he's trying to like kind of like buffer my expectation of him ahead of time.
No,
Like
no.
a little bit of an asterisk.
I
on
was
this
about to
thing,
say that's
so-
perfect because we need a phosphorus
Yeah,
expert.
that's right.
Knowing how inefficient we are with phosphorus in general, we need people like you. So that's good.
Yeah.
If you
Dr.
guys saw the numbers on phosphorus sales, they're really, really low.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be some questions in the next few years about how that plays out.
100%. I know I'm going to touch. I got a few questions that kind of touch on our current phosphorus use
Yeah.
efficiency and being a finite resource. What's that look like in years to come?
But
So-
you've got the best right here
There
to
we
answer
go.
the questions. Yeah.
Mike, you were a guest of ours previously in one of our episodes. We got the most comments on from a range of people, from growers to other agronomists to other professors. For those listeners that maybe don't know, you kind of fill us in on where you're from and where you went to school.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me again, guys. I appreciate the kind words. Got a lot of good feedback. You guys have some great listeners. As Andrew mentioned, I'm a suburb kid too. I went to college in Rhode Island, grew up in the suburbs of New York City. Dad took the subway and bus to work every day. And I studied environmental science, and I read a book by Václav Smil. And much like the Michael Pollan book, was kind of transformational for Andrew. That book, Enriching the Earth, all about nitrogen, was transformational for me. I mean, it really made me understand that if I wanted to have an impact in environmental science, there was no better place to do it than food production.
That's awesome. We'll know the impact of our show at some point if the book sales of these two books go up on Amazon.
There you go. Yeah, I think somebody mentioned Rogan before this started, and like if you're lucky enough to get on his show, I think like the next day you're a #1 bestseller. But both those guys might sell like one more book, but that'd be
Rogan and I are both from Newark.
yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, all sorts of similarities. But no, greatly appreciate you guys being here, and also I'm reminded Andrew and I have other opportunities outside of the podcast. We recently got to spend time with the science-bound kids from Iowa State, and when I hear both of you tell that story about reading the book and how it ignited your passion, our challenge to them is you cannot make a significant difference if you don't find the thing that you're passionate and endlessly curious about, because otherwise you're just going to work to check the box or do the job. And both of you certainly have that, and we're appreciative of that. It's fun to get to tell that story. Before we dive into your research, the question we start the show with is, what has you excited in agriculture today? So, Dr. Margenot, let's start with you.
That's a broad one. And you gave me the question with ample heads up, and I'm still not quite certain on the best answer. But what excites me the most about agriculture feels like we're at not a tipping point, but there's this growing crescendo of pressures. This sounds like a bad thing. I think it's an opportunity for stimulating some growth. I'm talking here everything from what I think you were hinting at earlier, Andrew, on soil testing and phosphorus. I think there's some paradigms that make sense when you've got wider margins economically, and now there's more scrutiny on some of these more gospel agronomic approaches. There's also new techniques that our predecessors could never really dream of that had been around for a while, but they're now more scalable. Everything from X-ray imaging of soils to isotopic methods that are now cheaper. So both the environmental economic climate as well as the research climate, they feel like they're getting to a point where not that we'll have a huge quantum transformation, but a small appreciable leap forward. So it's a whole mix of things, really. That's a non-answer for you, but many things at once.
It's a good answer. And we have recently talked about how it seems like there's kind of this ebb and flow where we settle into, we've accepted a certain amount of science, we do things a certain way. I couldn't agree more that it feels like the highest level of high quality questions are being asked right now. And should we be thinking about things the way we always have, or should we be thinking about them differently? some of that is outside pressure, but I sense that even internally in agriculture is just people have a renewed desire to make sure they understand they're doing it the right way. So I don't think that was a non-answer at all. I think that was perfect.
That's a good one.
How about you, Mike?
We can compare your previous answer to it
Yeah.
and then see what the impact of time has been.
Yeah, you know, I didn't go back and listen to it purposely because of that. Although, yeah, when you guys sent the questions, I thought about it. I mean, I think, guys, we're really at a unique place in history. When I talk with my kids at the dinner table, you know, I think about things like they're going to be the first people in the world to live through a population decline globally. I think it's really remarkable when you think about it. And agriculture has had remarkable success, you know, in feeding the world. We've never been in a place like this ever before. And we're also kind of a victim of our success too, right? With the environmental pressures that come along when you have such a productive system. And how do we come up with solutions to maintain the productivity we have, grow the productivity we have? Is even though the population declines, protein consumption, protein demand will increase. So we need to produce more food. How do we do that in an environmentally sustainable way? And I think we're also at a really unique time where the advances in digital and precision agriculture are coming along with the advances in data science. We're all using AI now. And the fact that really a farmer goes through billions of potential scenarios every year when they plant a crop. You know, when you do the math across all the varieties of seed they can plant, Sean, the number of the days they could plant on, the soil management, the residue management, the 4 R's of fertilizer management, and then you layer weather on top of that, really billions of potential outcomes. And I think we're going to be able to begin to solve some of those. Yeah.
That answer is, it almost gives me chills because I was thinking about this the other day when we asked Dr. Fred Below what drove his career. He talked about, you know, the prediction of population and kind of the inverse relationship to yield, and how so much of his work in the 7 Wonders of Corn was this idea that if we don't solve this, we won't produce enough to feed the world. And I think for a ton of us, that's been this driving factor, right? Like we have to produce more, we have to produce more. And I've recently been wrestling with that conversation. So as the population declines for the first time, protein goes up, the modeling around where does this stuff really land feels more complicated than it ever has. Because it felt like at one point it was just more into perpetuity, right?
Yeah, right.
And that seems like that's leveling off. And now we're asking a lot more of those questions. So we could probably have a philosophical discussion that could take the whole time. But yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah, it's a unique time. Yeah.
What'd your kids say?
You know, I'm not sure they like appreciate the full grasp of it yet, and like what the implications are from a food production and environmental perspective. You know, how we address the political system as populations change. Yeah, there's a lot to it.
They're probably still at the age where they learn what a million versus a billion, right? Just that alone is hard to, you know what I mean, understand.
It's often a question, Andrew, I ask on my junior level exams, you know, just to get them thinking about, you know, 1,000 million and a billion. Yeah. It's really a huge difference. Yeah.
No, let's get started. You know, we kind of wanted to give you both time to talk about your research. You know, that's maybe a little bit of a difference with this episode. We're going to focus on the science. Andrew, let's start with you. Kind of tell us about your research, you know, kind of what you've done and what you're currently doing. Take as much time as you want.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief here. So I showed up in Illinois in 2017, and I had trained mostly on phosphorus and soils. A lot of that was from working in the tropics, where generally phosphorus is more limiting of crop yields than nitrogen. It depends on the soil types here, but think of these red soils. We call them tropical soils. There's no such thing as a tropical soil, right? Think of the Andes Mountains. They're on the equator, but it's snow-capped peaks. So, but generally speaking, red soils are more weathered. You're seeing all the iron rusting out. And in these systems, phosphorus is pretty deficient. So from that context, when the one tool you have is a hammer, all the problems are nails. And I ended up in a good place with lots of nails of Illinois, a lot of phosphorus challenges here. So I got lucky in that sense of being able to swing the hammer of, okay, what are phosphorus-centric problems? But that was the gateway topic, the gateway drug that got me into other nutrient questions for growers in the state of Illinois. One thing that came up again and again was why are we losing so much phosphorus from the state of Illinois? So we're not talking fields, we're talking about statewide. USGS has gauges on all the streams that feed into the Mississippi, and our phosphorus loads, the pounds of P that exit the state, they just keep going up and up. And this is despite, at the time, some limited evidence that we're not over fertilizing relative to crop offtake rates on average. Of course, some places over apply relative to the crop uptake and harvest with grain. But on the whole, there's this negative P balance. And this smells like a really good scientific problem to dig your teeth into, right? There's no paradoxes, just really crappy explanations. You're missing something big if you got these irreconcilable phenomena happening. So that was the start of this program on phosphorus. That's one of the defining features of what we do. So that's one topic. What that looks like today is looking everything from the soil scale, understanding how phosphorus binds to clay particles. And we have a high level sense of how that works, but I would argue a lot of the biology of the P cycle is not so clear. So here I'd like to provoke the audience a little bit and point out that phosphorus in some sense takes the complexity of nitrogen in the organic matter phase and adds to that this inorganic chemistry phase that can make it a little bit harder to understand. But that said, there's more nitrogen mass that fluxes, that flows through soils and cropping systems than for P. So we've got a bit more complexity in some sense. In some sense, we don't, because there is no gas phase of P. There is for nitrogen. So it's an interesting complement to nitrogen, phosphorus. So a lot of our program focuses on everything from applied aspects, like the critical value. We can talk about the hallowed critical soil test values that you're supposed to build to. Whether that makes sense, as what Mike was saying, I'm pretty skeptical. And I think it's good to be a heretic in these economic climates that we're seeing, whether it pays to add phosphate and potash for that matter. Then there's more applied stuff on water quality of, well, why are we losing more P despite underapplying relative to crop offtake rates? And I think a really important concept here that we can get into later is legacy phosphorus. So that's the main bulk of our program on phosphorus. And on nitrogen, as I mentioned, I'm certainly not an expert like Mike. I'm wading into it. That takes more of a view of organic nitrogen cycling, things like enzymes and microbes, and more of the mechanisms that underpin what we see as these outcomes of importance. And use efficiency, nitrate leaching, they're all connected through this pathway of cycling.
Man, that sounds fascinating. I look forward to talking the management part as we talk the impact of concentration. And I know I'm reminded of we had a professor on here from Ohio State, and one of his quotes was, "Phosphorus loves to bind to anything and everything." And that really stood out.
Yeah, if I could add a few more thoughts to that, I would say phosphorus is sluggish and slow. Nitrogen is fleeting in terms of phosphorus.
Nitrogen is fleeting. I like that.
The other one is that nitrogen is like beer and phosphorus is like tequila. A little bit of phosphorus goes a long way in water quality impacts. It takes a lot of beer to have the same outcome as tequila.
He's already got a couple T-shirts, so that's really good.
Now I know why I like nitrogen.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Andrew, would you talk a little bit when I first had the opportunity to hear you speak? It was around some of the watershed work you're doing and kind of some of the water quality monitoring. We talk a little bit about that and kind of what you guys set out to learn and some of the work that you're doing to learn that stuff.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Sean. So what you heard that day was a presentation to Iowa Corn on some work we're doing on farm. We call it the Field to Stream project because we have 23 fields. These are commercial corn, soybean fields that we monitor continuously for tile export, as well as inputs of fertilizer, atmospheric deposition. Our goal is to make a full balance of nitrogen and of phosphorus. So we measure greenhouse gas emissions, deposition from the atmosphere. Rainfall carries a little bit of nitrogen, 10 pounds a bend per acre roughly is what we're finding. We look at the groundwater upswell, how that might contribute nitrogen and phosphorus. And I think most importantly, we can link the balance at the field scale, what's coming in and what's coming out, with what's being exported via tiles. And this is, I think, a really important question that we could talk about is assumptions on where in space and time does the balance predict the loss, or does it? Is it a useful heuristic to navigate discussions on water quality? So that's the field component. Then we go to the stream, where in the same watershed, we monitor the stream continuously at 5 sites. It goes from the headwaters to where it hits the larger river. This is a 12,000 acre catchment, Walnut Creek. And there's something like 50 Walnut Creeks in every Corn Belt state. The pioneers were not super creative in how they named, I think, their catchments. So the value of that, I think, is linking the field data, tile hydrology, the flashiness of tile discharge, and the nutrient loading with what we observe in the stream itself. And what we're finding is there's some interesting overlooked considerations, like much of the nitrogen that we measure in the stream of the total N load is organic matter N. And then of the nitrate that we're finding, it carries a signature isotopically of organic matter origin. So it mineralized from organic matter. For the phosphorus that we also track in tiles and streams in this catchment, we find a lot of it is sediment bound. That's not really a new idea, but using cosmogenic nuclides. So when it rains, there's a faint amount of radioactive elements that tell you how recently was a sediment mobilized. Was it touched by rain recently? So we can use this trace signal to understand, is it young or is it old sediment? And we can fingerprint that sediment and thus the P that's carried with it. We can tell, is it from fields or from stream banks? And what we're finding is that most of our P discharge from the small stream into the big stream and thus into the Mississippi in this location is largely from stream banks. Stream banks are full of native phosphorus. They erode. That's a normal process. And with that, there's a pretty appreciable phosphorus piece of the pie that's from these stream bank processes. So that was in a nutshell, Sean, what I think that you're getting at is trying to link field to stream and then trying to do what I would think of as the source apportionment. Where is it coming from? Where is the nitrogen from? Where is the P from? There's a lot of challenges to these questions, but trying to answer them, I think, can deliver some insights to management, but also water quality policy that's more grounded and thus more effective.
Andrew, I'm thinking about Illinois as a state. I don't know the percentage. I'm just guessing that a majority of the state's conventional till still. Would that be safe to say?
If by conventional you mean chisel, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
There's a fair amount of no-till in the south. So south of I-70,
Yeah,
where the
yep.
glaciation was less recent. Mhm.
Yep. Okay. So thinking about that, how do you see most? I know you've looked at a lot of phosphorus loss, obviously with your research. Where is that coming from? I know typically we think of phosphorus as an extremely non-mobile nutrient in the soil. What do you find? Are you finding a majority of it just simple runoff, or are you finding some? I've seen some data and results from looking at nutrients within drainage tile, and it can be pretty surprising when you look at some of those nutrients in there. So talk to me about what you see with that.
Sure, yeah, happy to. So it might be good to think about overall amounts of phosphorus entering and leaving a cropping system, to frame the discussion. So this is, again, where the comparison to nitrogen is a bit instructive. So for phosphorus, you figure a typical application of fertilizer of 200 pounds of DAP or MAP per acre every 2 years. On an elemental phosphorus basis, so we're not saying P2O5, but the pure element of P, we're talking somewhere in the order of about 40 pounds of P per acre. This is quick mental math right now. So that's what's fluxing in. The math here is that MAP is 52% P2O5 and roughly 40% of that is P. Okay, so we have 40-ish pounds of P per acre entering with the application. And then if you figure, good yielding corn, soybeans, like 250 bushel corn, 75 bushel soybean, roughly 35 of that to 40 is coming out. It's roughly neutral balance in this example. If you think about the losses that we're seeing, we know that our watersheds in Illinois that are the loss hotspots, this is true of the Corn Belt, it's roughly 1 to 2 pounds of P per acre, 1 to 2 pounds. And so as a percent and magnitude of the application, we're talking a 4 to 5% loss. But here's the first challenge already is that, well, a magnitude equivalency is not the same as that's the origin of the P loss. We're saying that amount as a percent. If you think about the pathways of loss, we've got about a quarter to half a pound of P per acre through tiles, through subsurface drainage tiles. Most of our P is lost not as dissolved P through tiles, but as surface runoff. So to put it differently, our P losses are really a soil conservation challenge. And I know that's less sexy than soil health. That's all the rage these days. But good old soil conservation is, I think, a way to dovetail soil health benefits that seem to be all the rage, and for good reason, I think, with our P loss reductions. To flip this, I don't think that we can use efficiency our way out of our P losses. Again, if all you're losing is 1 or 1.5 pounds of P per acre, that's enough to be a severe loss hotspot. But that's something like achieving 97% P use efficiency. That's probably not going to happen same season, but then P is residual. It's not like nitrogen. It's not fleeting. So probably our PUE is much higher than what people think is 16%. Is probably like 80% over 5 or 10 years. So that's a whole separate thread of discussion. To pull back here, conservation of soil is probably the best way to reduce off-field losses. But I want to point out there's been some great work by folks like Keith Schilling from Iowa showing that stream bank erosion is a fairly appreciable piece of the pie of Iowa's export. And our data from Illinois, though it's younger data set, is agreeing with roughly a third of the non-point losses of P are originating from stream bank erosion.
Andrew, you touched on something. I've heard a number of different percentages in terms of our average phosphorus use efficiency here in the Corn Belt. I've heard commonly 12 to 15%. Where is that roughly what you're seeing? Where you think we're at?
It's a can of worms, Andrew. So I'm sure Mike has got ideas here on use efficiency, but I mean, I think the first question on any metric of use efficiency is, well, what's the numerator and what's the denominator, right? It's some kind of a ratio. Like you hear about it takes so many gallons to grow one almond, and well, that's a water metric. There's also a protein metric, a caloric metric. For PU sufficiency, 16% is thought to be the global average. There's a meta-analysis study done in 2017 that suggested this number. And that can be disheartening. A lot of people hear this, the policymakers and growers, and think, well, then why am I adding so much phosphate if I'm using 16%? And that already to me is something goes off in my head of like, well, that can't be right. Because if farmers really only needed 16% of the application, wouldn't they have figured this out by now, right? So there's obviously reason that folks are applying more than 16% of the current application rates. That number, Andrew, comes from what's called the balance approach. So you look at how much P was put on that year, and then how much P came off with the crop harvest, be it silage or grain or whatever. And that number is roughly 16%. But this gets back to my contention here that P is fleeting, that P is not fleeting and P is going to stick around. So say that in 1 year you use 16% of the application, what you didn't use is not being lost. So that other, 84% of P that was applied and not exported with crop harvest, it's still there for the taking for the next year and the next year and the next year. So over the course of 5 or 10 years, the cumulative P of that original application is likely to be used. Some will be tied up with minerals, what some folks call fixation. And here's where we have to be honest. We don't know what that cumulative usage over time is. Here, I would argue that we have nitrogen envy when it comes to phosphorus science. We don't have stable isotopes for phosphorus. So for nitrogen, you've got different stable isotopes that let you trace and track, and Mike is an expert on this. For phosphorus, we only have one stable isotope, 31P. So we can't use another stable isotope. It's stable, it exists forever, and trace the fate of where that P ended up. Now we have unstable isotopes. Unstable because they decay, and as they decay, they give off energy, what we call radiation. And the half-life here is very short. It's only 25 days when you lose half the signal. So we do have these isotopic options for phosphorus. We can't exactly rain down radioactive phosphorus on a cornfield. Well, we could, but that's a whole permit mess. And even if we could do that, apart from the environmental issues, which are fair, is that within a month, you've lost half the signal. In the next month, half of the half. So it quickly peters out and you can't really track where that phosphorus went. So this is a salient challenge. And I would argue we can't ever really get to the level of knowledge for P that we've had for nitrogen, which makes it exciting. That's not a reason to despair. It's a reason to dig in deeper and try harder.
I think when we get to the management side specifically, it will be fun to kind of unpack the challenge there of mathematically, okay, so it is building in the soil, but we know pretty quickly if we stop applying, we see that almost immediately, right? We have learned pretty quickly if we under apply from our traditional rates, it doesn't take long for that to show up. So I'll be curious to unpack that a little bit, but Dr. Castellano, will you kind of fill us in on what you've been working on, some of your research, and then we'll put both of you on together and ask you guys some questions about the research and the findings.
Yeah, sure, Sean. We've been continuing to work on the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative, which we talked about last time I was on. I can't remember where we were in terms of number of trials in the state and products we had rolled out. So let me just provide a little bit of update there. And a little bit of background on the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative for new listeners. So it's a public-private partnership between the university, me, and my colleague Soterios, who you had on a few weeks ago, the ag groups in the state, and most importantly, Iowa farmers. And what we do through this partnership is we use the latest advances in digital and precision agriculture to allow farmers to conduct fully replicated, scientifically robust nitrogen fertilizer rate trials on their fields at the touch of a button. So they really don't have to do any work other than oftentimes we can send the nitrogen prescription to them digitally through the cloud into their tractor. They apply it. They send us the as-applied data back. They send us the yield data back, and we have an experiment. And so, a few years ago, I think, we probably had around 200 trials in the state in partnership with something like 50 farmers. Last year, we had over 600 trials in partnership with 140 unique farmers. So the demand for participation far outstrips our ability to conduct the trials, which is just fantastic. And I just want to thank Iowa farmers because they do this on a 100% voluntary basis. We're not paying them to do this. They're doing it out of their own curiosity and their own generosity to contribute those data to the broader community so we can all learn about how to better manage nitrogen.
Yeah. Mike, one of the most impactful points that you made with the last conversation was around nitrous oxide. And, to help our listeners understand why this is such important, we're thinking about it from an agronomic perspective, right? Where we're trying to maximize bushels produced per pound of nitrogen that we put on or give recommendations to. Talk to us about the importance and the impact, why studying nitrogen is so important in terms of nitrous oxide or even just nitrates in the water.
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. So start off with nitrous oxide and then maybe talk a little bit about nitrate in the water. But from the nitrous oxide perspective, we've got a really unique opportunity with the potential behind this 45Z tax credit that is gaining a lot of attention. So I think most folks have heard of the carbon intensity score now that's associated with that. And the lower the carbon intensity score of our grain production, whether it's corn or soybeans, perhaps the more value that they might return as we sell them for biofuel production. And nitrous oxide, we really should be calling the carbon intensity score, both corn and soybeans, the nitrogen intensity score. And the reason for that is that 75% of the score for corn comes from nitrogen, not from carbon dioxide. Specifically, 25% of the total score comes from the energy embedded in producing the nitrogen fertilizer, which of course, is accounted for because if we didn't grow the crop, we wouldn't be producing that fertilizer. And then 50% of that score, to make up the total 75%, comes from nitrous oxide emissions from the field. Soybeans, it's 67% of the score is nitrous oxide emissions from the soil. So an even greater proportion attributable just to nitrous oxide. So what is nitrous oxide? Why do we want to reduce it? Why is it part of carbon intensity? So nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas, a heat-trapping gas that's produced by microbes naturally living in the soil. Our soil management practices and fertilizer application in particular, they accelerate the production of that. But all natural systems produce some, just like nitrate. But the background levels are very, very low in the absence of agriculture. Now, other industries, other sectors, whether it's transportation industry, they all have ready-made decarbonization solutions, largely because their emissions are associated with the combustion of fossil fuels, right, to CO2. And, whether it's batteries, nuclear, wind, which we're leaders in Iowa, and I'll come back to that in a second, they have these solutions, they just need to implement them. In agriculture, it's not as easy for us because, as I mentioned, that nitrous oxide is being produced by microbes living naturally in the soil. And do we accelerate their production? Absolutely. But they're there whether we're managing the land or not. And so it's a big challenge. The soil microbiome is the most complex microbiome in the world. The ruminant would be the next most complex. So agriculture is leading in complex microbiomes. But again, real opportunity with the advances in data sciences and artificial intelligence to learn how those things operate and how we might better manage them. But just to bring this back full circle to the importance for Iowa and nitrous oxide, at a national scale, agriculture accounts for about 11% of greenhouse gas emissions. Iowa, it's about 33%. It's the leading sector of greenhouse gas emissions. And it might be easy to say, well, Iowa's a leader in agriculture, and so no wonder it's that big. But it's not just that. It's that we're also a leader in renewable energy, wind energy in particular. And because we've decreased that piece of the pie attributable to energy generation, agriculture naturally increases because we don't have the solutions there. And so we do a lot of work on those solutions. Andrew and I do a lot of work together on solutions for soybean in particular, early planting. We can reduce nitrous oxide emissions significantly by planting soybeans earlier in the season. Why such a simple intervention works? Because we're better timing the production of nitrate from the soil organic matter, a process that's happening naturally, with the crop demands. Of course, that's the biggest cause of our nitrate losses is this mismatch between the microbial production of ammonium and nitrate in the soil and the plant demand for that. And so 2 points I want to make on that is, one, when crops are growing, corn and soybeans are among the most nitrogen use efficient plants in the world. It's just that they're not growing for a significant portion of the year. So when I think about nitrogen use efficiency, I think about things like cold tolerance. That would be high on the list.
So still growing, actively growing, taking up nitrogen even in cooler conditions.
Well, and let's back up so we don't gloss over that. And so this was one of the really aha moments for me when we spent time together the first time. And so our listeners understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is when we think through a typical spring in Iowa, or really in the Midwest, we start to heat up. We start to add moisture to the soil profile, oxygen to the soil profile. And that typically happens, March or early April, right? And then a few weeks after that, we plant our crops. And then it's several weeks after that before we start to hit those nitrogen uptake curves. And so what we have happening is that natural production of nitrogen is happening weeks, even sometimes months before the crop wants any of it. We've also typically oversaturated with synthetic nitrogen during those seasons, right? So we've created this abundance of nitrogen synthetically and naturally at a time when we're not matching the crop need. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, it's generally correct. A couple things I'd emphasize there, Sean, is microbes turn on and off. They're not like a crop where you need weeks of growth before you reach significant rates of nitrogen uptake, of nitrate and ammonium uptake. Microbes, if you get a 60-degree day in February, they'll turn on and they'll produce ammonium and nitrate. And so, yes, generally the process doesn't really accelerate until the end of March, the microbial production process, but you get accumulation from those few warm days you do get. And that can go all the way back to the fall, of course, even before it gets cold.
And my mind immediately goes to at least the last 2 years in central Iowa, maybe the last 3, we've had 70 and 80 degree days in March. I mean, we've had a week of 70 and 80 degree days in March, and then typically the pattern one right now, it cools back off in early April. So that's fascinating that your point is there's not an on ramp and off ramp time. It's we can flip that switch that quickly.
Yeah. I also wanted to make the connection, Mike, and I'd love your take on this. We're talking about this from the impact on the environment, and we'll talk management and the impact on growers, but there's that connection here where when you have nitrous oxide, when we have loss, whether it's nitrate through the drainage tile or nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, that's money lost to the grower, right? That's money they spend on fertilizer that their plant's not going to be able to take up. And so there's that connection there, which we'll talk about how to manage through that in the management portion, but build on that.
Yeah, no question about it, Andrew. And also, missed growing degree days in the spring is missed bushels at the end of the season, right? And so I think the incentives are aligned here, right? How can we get in the field earlier? How can we plant earlier, both to capture more sunlight as we approach, the solstice, and how to, and that'll naturally reduce our nitrogen losses, both to nitrate and N2O. The second point I wanted to make is a follow-up to Andrew's quick mention that they have results in Illinois now that using the isotopic tracers, it's a good thing Andrew's got that fundamental chemistry background, that a significant portion, most, Andrew, of the nitrate you can source to organic matter in the tile drains. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on the time of year. And then also what we see, Mike, is in the streams in these corn, soybean field watersheds, a lot of the stream total N and nitrate N is isotopically looking like organic matter derived from that season. Yeah.
And I think that is, it's 100% consistent, with the research at Iowa State that show even when we don't fertilize corn for years, so zero fertilizer for years, totally, an impossible scenario. Nitrate levels in the tile drainage really don't go below 8 milligrams per liter. And,
Glad you brought that up. Well, I mean,
I was hoping we wouldn't get to this till later, so I would be able to keep my blood pressure under
control.
control.
To get Sean going, but I think that's critical. As we always hear about this on the news, right? Nitrate levels in the water, and so much gets blamed on farming. And it's good you bring that up because we know that even with zero synthetic nitrogen applied, because of our organic matter and because of mineralization, we would still have nitrates in running through the drainage tile.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. We do need to be careful, to be very clear, though, that our annual cropping system is the cause of the problem. It's not so much the fertilizer as it is those lack of demand periods in the system.
The non-overlap.
Right. Yep. So, we still have to own the problem, but we just have to understand the problem to think properly about the solutions that'll fix the problem.
Yeah. Well said.
I want you to say that again because I think it's critical. That's something we need to pull out and really make sure we understand. So repeat what you just said. The issue is not the fertilizer. It is the lack of timing. So, see if you can say that again as eloquently as you said it.
Yeah. So the primary issue is not the fertilizer. We have room for improvement, no question about it. And we can talk about that. How do we improve water quality through fertilizer management? There's a lot of, and manure management in particular, there's a lot of opportunity there, but it's not nearly as great as the opportunity to increase the length of the growing season. So I always like to think, always be growing. My colleague, Dan Anderson, likes to say that. I'm a huge Glengarry Glen Ross fan. For those of you out there, always be closing, always be growing. That's the primary solution. Fertilizer management plays a role, no question about it. When we're ready to go down that direction, just let me know, and we'll talk about how we can better manage fertilizer to reduce losses. Yeah.
Well, I think we want to talk about that. I think we need to save a portion of that, obviously for when we get into the management portion. we started asking about your research, and you were talking about the scale of moving up the amount of Iowa farmers. So would you just kind of talk a little bit about what that looks like for the farmers you participate with? So you talked about, sending that to them, they're returning the data. Talk a little bit about what you're learning in that process.
Yeah. So we're learning a lot. And so let me start off logistically. When we started the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative, we thought recruiting farmer partners would be the biggest challenge because we had a target of 400 trials per year. We clearly found out that was not the big challenge. Getting the management data is a challenge. And that's really important because, we can have 95% of the data, let's say, comes through, a farm management software that the farmer is using. If we don't have that extra 5%, though, let's say you had a custom strip tillage operation that doesn't go into that farm software. Now, all of a sudden, our predictions and forecasts are inaccurate, right? And so we are learning what pieces are the most important, what pieces of information are the most important to have, how we have conversations with our farmer partners to make sure we get those data and their agronomists. And then, in terms of the data, what are the data telling us? The data are telling us that our farmers are extremely close to the economically rational rates for their operations. That farmers do seem to be quite dialed into those rates. And that doesn't mean there's not more we can do. There certainly is. And I'll get into the nuts and bolts of that in the management portion. But given the information they have now, that they're operating with now, they're relatively close to those rates. As we gain more information, they can get even closer. And that's where the environmental and the profitability improvements will come.
So give us a quick overview of what one of those trials looks like on a farm.
Yeah, so it's about 5 to 10 acres, and we have 25 plots. It's like a checkerboard. There are 5 nitrogen rates. Generally, the middle one is the farmer's rate, and we ask them to have 2 rates lower by about 40 and 80 pounds and 2 rates higher by about 40 and 80 pounds. And then we're able to calculate the yield response curve as a result of that. In many of the trials, we do extensive plant and soil sampling as well, so we can measure how much nitrogen's in the profile, how much nitrogen the crop is taking up, and that leads us to another big finding, and that is we think we can really improve the late spring nitrate test, which you guys may be familiar with. Hasn't gotten a lot of traction in the past because it's a relatively inaccurate test, to be fair. And a lot of that, though, is limited information for decision making. So we use process models, and we have an NFACT tool, n-fact.ag. Hopefully you guys can put that up as you post the recording. I think that's new since we last chatted, but that has 2 tools within it. One is a benchmarking tool where you can see the results of real trials. So I like to say, just while it's critical that we're monitoring water quality in the state of Iowa, it's also critical that we're monitoring optimum nitrogen rates because they're constantly changing, not just from field to field, but year to year as well. And we need to understand that if we're to better manage fertilizer for sure. The second tool is a modeling tool. And my colleague Sotirios, who you spoke with, he really leads the development of this tool. And so this took us from a nitrogen decision-making framework. You guys may be familiar with the MRTN approach, which a number of states in the Corn Belt use. Generally, those states have 4 scenarios, a couple geographies by whether the corn follows corn, whether the corn follows soybeans. So you have, maybe four potential fertilizer rates. With NFACT now, we have over 20,000 potential scenarios that farmers can go through and select to identify what the range may be of their optimum nitrogen rate. And one of the factors that you can select in that is your residual soil nitrogen in the profile. So how much nitrate is there, and how does that help you reduce that uncertainty in what your optimum rate is so you can lower your optimum rate?
It's funny you bring that up because we had that conversation with Sotirios and how many growers right now are going out and trying to figure out how much nitrogen they have left over after the growing season, right?
Yeah.
And you get into the whole variable rate fertilizer versus understanding how much you have left over at the end of the growing season. We have a lot of room for improvement in that area.
No question about it, Andrew. And I think it really links back to the process we talked about earlier with the temperature and the moisture, Sean. You know, one thing Soterios and I are trying to do is to move that late spring nitrate test to the fall when it would be more convenient for the grower to sample it along with, potassium and phosphorus, Andrew. So you get all that stuff done in one shot. And the thinking behind that is if the soil is 50 degrees and cooling, conditions when we'd be okay applying ammonia, for example, or hog manure, that nitrogen is relatively stable in the profile. And if you plant early enough in the next spring, in the absence of a lot of rain, that nitrogen should still be in the root zone. And that's something we're testing.
I want to go off script here. Since me and Sean are switching roles, I'm going to go off script here, and you guys both got me thinking about. I'm curious. I'd like both your input. Right now, we have growers that often soil sample every 4 years, and if you look at some of our learnings from the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, and also taking into consideration yield potential is higher, our removal rates are higher, so we're putting more on at the end of the growing season. What's your thoughts on soil sampling every 4 years, liming every 4 years, letting your pH go up and down, and just, again, thinking about removal rates, how much we're applying compared to 10, 15 years ago, the impact of maybe soil sampling every year or two versus every 4 or 5 years.
I think the chemist should take that one.
What's your thoughts there on that, Andrew? Because I know, I tell growers with the cost of inputs and the cost of soil sampling, I don't know how we're not soil sampling every year.
And can I add on to that? I got a question for Andrew too. How much, in these times with really high phosphorus prices, Andrew, can we manipulate soil pH to loosen things up for us? Is there any potential there?
There might be. So I'm hearing a few things here, right? So one is frequency of soil sampling and considerations of frequency.
Yeah.
The other is okay. And then the second topic then, Mike, is whether pH might be a way to free up or liberate more P in the soil and thus reduce inputs. They're both good points. So in terms of the soil testing that Andrew proposed, frequency, you could think of this as like space and time. I wonder if maybe 4 years is fine, but maybe higher density sampling might offer greater returns on soil testing. If you think about the variability of phosphorus, because it is relatively immobile, grid sampling, like 1 acre grid or 2 acre grid, might be a way to make use of the same testing dollars, lower time frequency, higher spatial frequency. So if folks are doing grid sampling for VRT, I think they're already there. But those that are just doing 5 or 10 acre grids, you might be missing a few acres where over time you've been either mining P or building it up. And the same goes for potassium levels too. So that's a hard question to answer, right? Is like, what's the right time? I would offer this up, and this is a soil scientist speaking. I think we put too much stock into soil testing for tracking our P and K removal rates. And I think we should be doing more grain testing. So I think of using soil testing to track what you're taking off is really an off-label use of testing. Soil testing was not really developed for monitoring with high confidence whether your maintenance rate is a maintenance or buildup is a buildup. The soil test principle, well, I'll back up here. The very first soil test is the Melick test, developed at the U of I. Sorry, the Bray test, 1945. Then the Melick test comes in 1980s that we now use for P and K. But all these tests, all they're trying to do is to give you a probability of a crop yield response to adding P or adding K. And then people blur the line of, well, it's available phosphorus or potassium. And that's an important misstep, because then people, I think, take it too literally that I have 30 pounds of P in the soil, and that's not quite true. You have actually thousands of pounds of P and K, and the soil has many diverse forms. It's really the spectrum of not available to available, and the soil reserves can replenish the soil test pool. So these soil tests are operational. They're just really quick proxies, fairly affordable to gauge if you're at this level on your soil test, might you see a yield response? And there, I'd challenge people to reconsider the soil test critical value. So you hear people want to build the soil test P up to a certain level. That's predicated on yield response probability. If you've seen the raw data, you know how messy it is. If you've not seen the raw data, I encourage you, go find it. It's like a shotgun blast on a target. So across any state, overall, it's a good average. But beware of the average if there's a fat distribution, because some fields are going to be well over or well under. So, for example, we've seen fields that are at 5 pounds per acre test P, no yield response to more P. And I've seen fields at 80 pounds per acre test P, huge response to P. And if you're that field, you really care about being that field and not using a statewide average or even a regional average. So I think that's the first thing to point out, is that I think we put a little too much stock into these soil test values as immutable, and you got to build to 25 ppm or else there's this cliff of yield loss. And even if there is a few bushel per acre loss, and I think I've heard this a few times now, are those bushels paying for the phosphate or the potash application?
Can
So to
you
put it
clarify
differently-
that quick, Andrew? Because I get that question a lot. I'll get other agronomists, growers, dealers have me look at a soil test with phosphorus specifically, and they assume that's available P. Can you just simply answer that? Is that what, whether we're looking at Malick, Bray, whatever, or is that available P?
Probably mostly. So let me explain. Probably mostly.
Probably mostly.
That's what I was getting at.
This stuff is messy. If you want to be very strict about it, we don't actually have a real measure of available P.
Yeah.
So here's my high standard. That atom or those atoms of phosphate that you're extracting on the soil tests are, for sure, being accessed and taken up by the crop. We don't have that. Now, it might be that these tests are reflecting that, but the data that we have with isotope labeling suggests not really. It's probably more of a Venn diagram where the circle of available, the real, what the crop is able to use, and what the soil test measures, they're probably pretty strongly overlapping, but they're not the same. And this might get a little bit like, who cares, right? If the soil test tells you the yield response likelihood, yeah, you should apply P or K. It's probably good enough. I think that the problem, though, Andrew, is that people take literally, oh, it's my available P. And if they see a change over time, they might get concerned. So here's a nice experiment for folks that have a few extra bucks to burn. In the same 1 acre or in the same 10-foot plot, take a soil sample every few weeks for the course of 4 to 5 months, and then send from that bucket of soil, subsample it, mix it up, and send the same soil sample as 3 separate samples labeled to the same lab. Do it again to send it to a different lab. And so what you'll find is that by time of sampling, by the sample replicate, so same lab runs the same soil 3 times, and then a different lab runs the same soil 3 times, there's massive variability in time, not even apart from the grid sampling space. And then from the analysis aspect, same lab, and then these different labs. And that's important. It's not to throw shade on these labs that do a decent job. You got to pick fast and cheap, but fast and super accurate, that's a different story. Overall, these tests give us a decent ballpark, but the variability is substantial. Space, time, the lab that runs it. So we can easily see soil test p-values fluctuate by 5 or even 10 ppm based upon these factors of where was the sample pulled, when was it pulled, who ran it, in the same lab or in a different lab. So that's a long way of saying that it's not available phosphorus. There's variability in that measurement that might be misconstrued as I'm losing 20 pounds of P per acre. No, it just went up and down because of natural processes.
You started answering that question and said perhaps frequency or perhaps grid size. But you also mentioned sampling grain as opposed to sampling the soil. Talk to me about your philosophy there.
Sure, and I think philosophy is an apt word here because it's really a hypothesis that we have. A lot of the farmers and crop advisors that we talk to are doing this or messing with it. So maybe it helps to talk a bit about removal rates. When you harvest a field, corn, soybean, there's nutrients embedded in the grain. And so you're exporting these nutrients, P and K especially. And I think any basic definition of sustainability is meriting the replacement of what you took off. Now, how often or how much you let things decline or build up, that's a different question. That gives you room to play. But ultimately, there's a law of thermodynamics here that you must return what comes off eventually. Okay, great. So how did we come up with these numbers of, well, I took off 250 bushel corn, I must put on this, or I should put on X amount of P and K? Most states have a handbook value or the coefficient of removal. Basically, for every bushel, corn or soybean or wheat, how many pounds of P2O5 or K2O came off? Okay, great. But now we have this distribution challenge where those values in these state handbooks are an average. And so if there's a wider distribution, and the average is in the middle, it's the 50th percentile, the wider that distribution, the less accurate for a given field that average value is going to be. The second hurdle here is that a lot of states, to be safe, use the 75th percentile value, like Illinois and like Iowa, I believe. And so you're not actually using an average value, you're using the 3/4 value. So then 3 out of 4 grain samples are actually lower than what you think is the P or the K offtake rate. And in these price years for inputs and grain prices, it means that you're probably overspending and over applying. So we've done some example studies of this where we find that in some fields, folks are doing what they think is a maintenance rate, but they're actually above maintenance. They're doing a build rate and they're burning dollars when maybe it was time to do maintenance or even a bit of a drawdown application. So that's what I'm saying. That
What does it look like for a Iowa or Illinois farmer to do that test? We're very familiar with soil sampling. What does it look like if I want to test that grain?
Well, I don't have any recommendations here because this is active research, but I think the first place to start is getting a sample off of the combine or the grain cart for the field. I think just benchmarking from that field for this hybrid, what does it look like for P2O5 and K2O per bushel values? Simple, easy to do. Any lab that can do foliar tests, it's the same chemistry that can do the grain tests. Tissue is tissue, whether it's leaves, stalk, or grain. It's the same process. It's the same price. So I think, Sean, that's the first step. If you're more ambitious, I think the same yield predictions where you look at 1,000th of an acre and you pick off the ears of corn and you count rows, the same grain samples can be mixed up, subsampled, and sent off to the lab. So if folks are doing yield estimates for corn, I would say that's a nice opportunity to look at P and K offtake rates. Soybean is trickier. You can try to estimate soybean yields, but I think stripping the grain off soybean would be tough. Maybe that's where you stop the combine every 10 acres and pull a sample.
There seems to be, when we interviewed Sartorius recently, there was a couple comments he made to me, and part of what I've been thinking about, and this might fit into the management side of the conversation, is just it's really frustrating to be on the industry side and in the sales side and try and cut through the noise of all this stuff going on. And so part of my hope as our audience listens to you guys is we would start to, on our own farms, think about how do I take some ownership in this, right? So what levers could I pull that give me some ability to reference year over year? So we talked about it on our own family farm after the last interview. We've never once done a fall nitrate test, ever. Well, I can tell you logically that means I've put way too much nitrogen on some years, and I probably haven't put on enough in other years. And the natural reaction is like, well, I don't know how to do that, or I'm scared of it, or I'm not sure I can map this out. My thought is, we've collected a lot of yield data for 30 years that we haven't necessarily understood what we were going to do. Why wouldn't we start building the library? So, Andrew, as you talk about that, I sit there and go, there just feels like there's some low-hanging fruit that as growers or advisors, we could start snagging and say, I don't even know if I know what this means today, but we can at least start building it into the library. I feel guilty often of just trusting the system the way the system's always worked. And Andrew, to your point, it's incredible. You look at some of these soil samples and just the dispersion of what's been applied. Well, it's clear we're not always getting it right. And I don't know that that's any one person's fault. We've just done what we've done. But to the comment in the beginning of like, it feels like we're at a tipping point. Man, it feels like we're past time to answer some of these questions and try and get better. We're way off script at this point, but would you add some context, your thoughts on what Dr. Margenot just shared?
Yeah, Sean, I mean, I think it really connects to what you said about your family farm. And I think an area where researchers can do a better job and where Andrew's working is, you know, you can't manage a commodity business for the average. You know, it just doesn't work, right? And there's a lot of uncertainty in our measurements. And I think as scientists and researchers with the limited resources we've had in the past, and this comes very much back to my initial point, we've thrown out a lot of averages with poor measurements of the variation and the uncertainty that's built into those averages and where that's coming from. How much of it comes from the soil sample? How much of it comes from the laboratory? How much of it comes from, well, the day I took the sample, it was 95 degrees, you know, versus a day when it was 55 degrees. It makes a difference. And we haven't done a good job quantifying all that. And as we do quantify that, I think we can have greater certainty and resolution in our data.
I'm going to try not
Are you
to
gonna go off
rant
script?
as hard as I ranted in our last episode.
Have to get Sean a Snickers again.
But I feel really passionate, Andrew, when you said this idea of a tipping point, right? So agriculture becomes efficient because of how long we've done it. And I think we're all relatively guilty of managing to the average. And part of it is, it's not, if you don't take some ownership, it's not designed to do anything different than that, right? Like our retail supply chain isn't set up to make it more complicated than that. We want a simple press a button in the cab, send it down the road, somebody comes in and does it. And there is benefit in the efficiency. And for the vast majority of us, we've done a practice and we've seen our output increase. So there's also the debate, do we have a problem, right? And then is the output increasing because I'm doing better, or is it increasing because there's other efficiency that's been created within the industry? So I spent like 10 hours with a couple of farmers in the truck on Monday talking about this, and it just gets me really riled up because, to your point, it does seem like at some point we've got to say there has to be better ways to ask these questions and then make management decisions, and especially when we have the economic tightness that we have right now. Gosh, why on earth are we just making relatively blanket decisions on only partial information? And so the conviction that I've formed really since the conversation we had with Sartorius is you can't wait till you're this frustrated to say, maybe I should start building a data library to help inform me of the choices I want. So I appreciate both of your ideas, because I can take that practically back and say, we may not radically change what we do next year or even 2 or 3 years from now, but if we have no baseline decision, if we have no baseline information, we can't make a different decision next time.
So that means come, let's say, well, it's October or November, Sean's going to have a soil test from his farm and give us data on that episode.
I will commit to that right now. Absolutely.
And we're not going to look at the average. We're going to look at the distribution.
Yep.
Yeah.
So my final science question for both of you, 2026 across Illinois. Man, I was in Illinois here numerous times over the growing season. Both Iowa and Illinois, we have dry spots, but we also have a lot of moisture. We've had a tremendous amount of rain in much of the areas within these states. I'm curious if you could fill on. I've seen data looking at cumulative nitrate loss through drainage tile. I've seen some data looking at the impact of a 1, 2, 3 inch, 4 inch, 5 inch rain in nitrate loss. I'm curious, both your perspective with 2026, what have you seen in, whether it's your research or just data, in terms of the impact of some of these moisture events on the pounds per acre nitrate lost in your states?
In Iowa, I think it gets back to Andrew's answer earlier. The timing really depends. When do you get that 1-inch rain? When do you get that 3-inch rain? Right now, the 3-inch rain has very little impact on nitrate losses because the evapotranspiration and nitrate uptake are so rapid.
Because we're so warm and we're filling grain right now, right? Okay.
We've got a huge nitrogen sink in the system and a huge water sink in the system. Evapotranspiration is really going, and nitrogen uptake by the crop is really going. You get a 1 to 3-inch rain in April, it's bad, right? We get a lot of nitrate loss, and so timing really is everything. And it's not even just within a year; it's also across years, right? So 2025 was a close to record year for nitrate loss. And what happened there? Well, we had several dry years followed by an extremely wet year, and an extremely wet year when we kept the surface soil warm and wet throughout the growing season, which meant that we had really high rates of nitrogen mineralization from that organic matter. And as a result, our optimum nitrogen rates, despite all that rain last year, were really low. I've actually got the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative annual report here, and I brought it because I knew I wouldn't be able to remember the numbers. But in 2025, near record or record year for nitrate loss, really wet year, you might expect optimum nitrogen rate to be really high, right?
Because we were wet early in Iowa, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
It was
But
100.
we also stayed wet all the way through mid-August. Right?
That's
so
right.
we had moisture and oxygen in the soil till August 20th last year, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yep. And one thing we talked about last time I was on was that, getting back to these numbers, Andrew mentioned thousands of pounds of P and K. Average soil in Iowa has 10,000 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we can count on 1 to 4% of that to turn into ammonium and nitrate, same exact compounds we buy in fertilizer every year. What controls that? How warm and wet is it? Microbes need water and they need temperature to transform that organic nitrogen, which is not susceptible to loss, also not susceptible, can't be taken up by crops, to the ammonium and nitrate.
So you're getting ready to read us some data. So you said 2025 was one of the largest nitrate losses?
Yeah.
Is that what I heard?
But it was also a record year for nitrogen mineralization in the soil, from the soil organic matter, because we had that continued warm, wet period, Sean. So it was 171 pounds per acre on average across the state. I know we just talked about not talking about averages.
Was mineralized?
No, that was the average optimum nitrogen rate for the corn. Yeah. The mineralization was over 150 pounds, and that was just in the surface soil where we're measuring it. So if you think about the whole profile, it would have been even more than
How deep is that when you say surface profile? 4 to 6 inches?
that would be the top foot.
Top foot. Okay.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Top foot.
And your corn roots are 5 plus feet.
Yeah, they go below the tiles.
Majority of them, though, I mean, you get a small percentage of your roots going that deep, but majority of them are in that top. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And a majority of the nitrogen is in the top too. But, that's also just 1 foot of a 6 foot or so soil profile.
Yeah.
So, Andrew, would you weigh in? So when we talk about record nitrate loss in 2020.
Let me interrupt you just for a second, Sean.
Okay.
I want to put that 171 pounds per acre optimum rate for nitrogen to corn last year in context, though. So that's the third year of the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative. In 2024, the year before, without that record precipitation, it was 226 pounds because we had much
You
lower.
were relying more on synthetic nitrogen versus mineralization.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the mineralization, that'd be what? I mean, is that 20, almost 25% decrease in need from 24 to 25, roughly?
Yeah. It's
20%.
it's over 50 pounds, right?
What other nutrients, whether it's you or the soil scientist, what other nutrients do we get from mineralization?
Well, hang on, because this is, I was really, really hoping we would get here. So, Andrew, you have done research trying to sort out when we have nitrates in the water, are they coming from a synthetic source or an organic source,
question.
correct? So my question for you, do you have data that you could cite or a hypothesis on when we are seeing exceptionally high nitrates in the water, a year like 2025 in Iowa, I'm assuming similar in the state of Illinois. Do you have a theory on how much of that is coming from synthetic loss versus mineralization?
It's a good question. So to answer that question, I would say, Sean, I think Mike might share this hypothesis that when you've got wetter years, there's probably a larger contribution of organic matter derived nitrate in the system, in the tile, in the stream system. There's some trade-offs here because there's less movement of water through the tile system that drags out nitrate. So drier years, less can mineralize, but there's also less overall export. And so the ratio is separate from the total amount being lost. And what we see in the stream work that we're doing is that during drier summers where there's less flow, there's tiles are almost not flowing. As Mike said, water is being used by the crop. It's not making it out through these tiles. We see that the proportion of stream nitrate and of total N as well is largely organic matter directly. It's dissolved organic N. And of the nitrate that we see, it's largely organic matter derived based on the isotopic signature. But here's what's interesting. 25 was actually a pretty dry year for us in Illinois, at least central north. Champaign County was in severe drought. And then where we monitor field to stream, these 23 fields and the watershed scale, they had only about 24 inches of precip. We typically get around 38 inches out there. So we had a pretty dry summer. Now we're seeing really high nitrate loss because all that nitrate was banked up in the profile. So we're a year behind you guys in Iowa in terms of central north of Illinois for seeing maybe not record, but certainly much, much higher losses of nitrate.
That adds the year over year impact that you kind of touched on, right?
Yeah.
Or in the residual and in combination.
And would you just, for my sake, explain when you say that in 25 the optimum nitrogen rate was 171, in 2024 it was
26.
226. What does the definition of optimum nitrogen rate mean?
Yeah. So when we say the optimum nitrogen rate, we assume a price ratio of 0.1, fertilizer to grain, and we use the yield response curve to the next pound of nitrogen added to determine when the next pound of nitrogen no longer pays for itself through a yield increase.
Interesting. I'm looking forward to the management conversation.
So I want to ask one or two more questions. And Andrew, I want you have every right to Fauci your way out of this one if you want. Plead the fifth, or we'll probably edit that out. I don't know that we need that in there.
That comes from the guy who asked for no policy.
I was trying to think of a way to give you permission to not answer the questions if you're uncomfortable with them. So we're gonna talk about the goal of being efficient, both driven by yield and ROI in the management portion. But if I'm in a watershed where I want to be mindful of my contribution to off-target movement of nitrate, I can obviously say I can't control the organic matter, right? I have no control over that. So based on those two numbers that you just gave, there's a relatively safe bet that the efficient rate of nitrogen, or the optimum rate of nitrogen next year, is going to be probably somewhere between 170 and 225, right? Or somewhere in that ballpark. So my question is, if I want to be conscientious of my contribution to nitrates in the water as an Iowa or Illinois farmer, what advice based on your research do you have?
Money aside, there's certain things that we can do that we know work pretty well. So I think we all agree that cover cropping, cereal rye, is a great way to decrease nitrate losses. And then there's this eternal tension of when you terminate, and the biomass development can ding or even drag yields pretty badly for corn because of the decomposition of the cover crop biomass. So one thing that we found from our work is that there's a lot to think about for how the tile flow might be important here. So Mike and I have a few projects, and some of our on-farm sites suggest that the more that a tile flows, the less that the cover crop might be effective to reduce nitrate loss. So from this on-farm network that I've mentioned, where we look at tiles on commercial fields, the fields that lose the most and that are least responsive to cover cropping are the high flow fields. And they're high flow fields because of topography of the water table it comes up. So we've seen with cover crops 80 pounds of N per acre loss out of soybeans after cover cropping because that tile was just discharging nonstop. That's how the field is in the landscape. So I think that's my biggest caveat, is that we find that, yes, these things work, things like cover cropping, and I'll let Mike talk more on the practices like side dressing and things like this. But one thing that I've taken away from our research on farm is practices apart from the economics. We have to, I think, contextualize with things like the total discharge of water, because I think that's an important caveat. Maybe those high flow fields are better the focus of water management. So can we manage the drainage of these high flow fields? What that looks like is difficult, right? We know that wheat is really good at drying up tiles. So if you're double cropping wheat and soybean, which in Illinois is becoming pretty common south of I-70, and it's creeping up northward, it's now in fact more profitable than corn soybeans south of I-70. Wheat has a good way of using up water. As Mike was saying, there's something growing there when it's the gray gap of harvest to typical spring planting of corn soybean. Wheat might be a way of stopping flow out of tiles, offering the benefits of nitrate scavenging, though we do fertilize wheat, so that gets awkward. But wheat might be useful as a way to stem the vertical downward flow and thus nitrate export. So that's where I think, I'm not sure how we can get here, but I think a promising avenue at the moment would be, we might want to rethink the management of water export from the field. And wheat, soybean double cropping is just one example of how that might happen. I know Mike has got some work in Iowa on retention and re-irrigating with that discharge water. So just a couple thoughts right off the bat.
So Sean, let me come back to your suggestion that we can't manage the organic matter. We can. And it's, weather is absolutely the number one cause, of how much we get and the variability from year to year. But I do want to emphasize that there is potential to manage that organic matter mineralization, how much we're going to get from the microbes for free every year. And managing that is the key to reducing our optimum nitrogen rates and the need or the economic rational choice to apply for that year when we needed 226 versus 171, right? Because in the absence of that extra information, that's the economically rational choice. And so a couple things that Andrew mentioned that I'd want to emphasize are tile drainage and residue management. The two biggest levers Soterios and I think we can pull on not just maximizing the amount of mineralization we get, but also minimizing the year-to-year swings in that mineralization and the year-to-year losses to the environment. And why does that happen? It happens a lot due to the water budget that Andrew just mentioned. And so this also complements an area of our research where we're trying to relieve pressure on our drainage systems, which are already overburdened, by putting more water into the atmosphere. Andrew mentioned wheat. That's one way to do it. We're experimenting with corn residue harvest here, partial corn residue harvest, doing the same thing. And we've shown last year, our first year of our work on this, that partial corn residue harvest can reduce nitrate loads by 30%. That rivals cover crops. Where did that reduction come from? It didn't come from a reduction in concentration. Concentration in nitrate was reduced a little bit, but the bulk of that came from a reduction in flow to the drains. We just didn't have as much drainage flow, exactly to Andrew's point there. So when we think about what can we do to maximize mineralization and reduce the year-to-year variability in it, drainage and residue work so well because they're drying out the soil essentially and allowing it to warm up faster. This a great anecdote that helps people understand this, I think, is the soybean nitrogen credit. We've all heard about that, right? I think we talked about that last time I was here. Yeah. But it's such a perfect complement to Andrew's discussion about the balances and like what can we and what can't we take away from the balances. Corn following soybean requires a lot less nitrogen, not because there's residual nitrogen left over from the soybean. In fact, all our research shows, mine, Ignacio's, Patricio, Grassini, soybeans, we take more nitrogen in the grain than they fix from the atmosphere. The soybean nitrogen credit is because there's much less residue on the soil surface. The soil dries out, it warms
Carbon
up
to
faster.
nitrogen ratio is less.
That contributes to it too. Yeah, no question about it.
When you talk about stover removal and that being in some instances equivalent to a cover crop, have you guys done work looking at the economics of that?
That's a great question, Sean. So we have not done the economics. I mean, we've done some rough assumptions on cost per acre to harvest it. Hopefully some industries would come along. I think we're at, I think residue harvest is it's a place just where government is supposed to operate, right? And the reason for that is we have a chicken and the egg problem. If we're going to have residue harvest, we have to have industry to support that residue harvest. For an industry to develop around residue harvest, we have to have farmers who are willing to harvest their residue, right? And so I think it's a perfect opportunity for a program where we try and accelerate this, incubate it, give some reason, some incentive to harvest it. And if it takes off, it takes off. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And we stop it and we go back to where we were. But I think also the residue harvest, I want to emphasize that it has to be part of a systems solution. Harvesting corn residue, it really improves cover crop growth. So I wouldn't think about it as, substituting for a cover crop. I think we can get additive nitrate loss reduction, and not even just additive, because that cover crop on that warmer, drier soil, it's going to grow better.
We got a lot to talk about. Come management.
As we close, I just want to thank both of you. So we've really had this idea of like passion and curiosity. That's kind of been what we've been really focused on, and it certainly is what drives our show. This stuff is super complex, and I think it gets really frustrating because social media, news cycles, and everything else, it makes it seem like there's just a simple switch we could flip and all these problems go away. And if it weren't for institutions like both of yours, your passion and curiosity and the hard work, I think we'd have a much less informed discussion. So appreciative of the hard work. I was laughing when I met Andrew, thinking about you and waders down in a stream, measuring turbidity. And, it's like maybe an office job wouldn't be so bad some days, right? And so just greatly appreciative of your guys' passion and expertise and willingness to share it with us. It's critical. Andrew, you started by talking about a tipping point, and I know that I think there's a lot of growers and advisors that feel that way, and so your guys' combined research is going to be critical to helping us understand that. So really appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Absolutely. Looking forward to the management conversation.
And thanks for pushing this work out, guys. You reach an audience that I think a lot of scientists, we live in our peer-reviewed world, and I think this is a tremendous help.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with Mike there. There needs to be a little bit more of this kind of discussion of scientists talking freely and openly, Sean, as you pointed out, with people who may have interests in this stuff. Maybe I could offer up some insight from a farmer that we work with. And he said to me about a month ago, you guys at the land grant don't innovate. We do that. And his point was that there's all these millions of man hours across the state, like Illinois, of farmers tinkering and messing with things. And you could argue that some things, like Mike's point on residue harvest, is innovation by researchers. So I don't think that I fully agree with this guy's statement, but he had a good point that a lot of farmers are doing things that are quite innovative, and the researchers can do a little bit more to listen to that. What researchers are very good at is documenting things. How is the system working? So this is not to say all or nothing, but the tipping point also, Sean, that I was getting at is I wonder if there's a new way for the land grant to reimagine its role in the 21st century. Things are very different in some sense than in 1860s. Some things are similar. But one way that we might be able to more effectively work with these farmers is observing what they're doing. Like the wheat double cropping system for the tile flow, that came out of a farmer's observations that his tiles dry up completely with the double cropping system. So sorry to suck us back into details, but thanks for having us here, because hopefully some folks hear this and are more willing to talk to us.
It's a great way to close the science episode. We've been innovating since the first day we turned ground, and I hope we never stop. And you guys play a critical role, and we're trying to contribute in our own way. And so appreciate your time today, and it'll be fun to talk management.
Absolutely.